All right, let's dive right into this explainer and transport you to Liverpool to uncover the surprising origins of the most famous music venue in the world. Now, when you hear the name the Cavern Club, your mind probably instantly jumps to the 1960s, right? You picture that iconic black and white footage of screaming fans, and of course, those four local lads who basically changed global pop culture forever. But you know, every legend has an origin story, and the true beginnings of this iconic space are actually far removed from the screaming pop hysteria we usually associate with it. Today, we're going back to 1957. We're going to explore the hidden prequel of the Cavern Club.
So I want you to start by asking yourself a pretty wild question. What if the world's most famous rock venue originally hated rock music? Seriously, I want you to completely forget everything you know about the 1960s Merseybeat era. Just erase the electric guitars and the pop harmonies from your mind for a minute. Imagine instead a time and a place where rock and roll was strictly off the menu. It wasn't just ignored, it was deliberately excluded. This cellar was built with a completely different sound in mind, and the journey from its intended purpose to its ultimate destiny is honestly one of the most fascinating pivots in music history.
The pop culture myth we all know tells us this is the undisputed birthplace of the Beatles, a global rock hub. But the reality? Well, it's completely different. When the doors first opened, it was a strict, unapologetic traditional jazz and skiffle cellar. The founders absolutely weren't looking to create a rock revolution. They were actually looking backward, aiming to preserve and celebrate traditional acoustic music.
Chapter 1: A Parisian Jazz Dream.
To really get the Cavern, you have to understand the guy who created it, a man who didn't even have his sights set on American rock and roll. His eyes were actually set firmly on Europe. Meet Alan Sittner. He was a visionary, and get this, he was just 21 years old. Think about that for a second. At 21, this passionate entrepreneur from Liverpool was absolutely determined to create the finest jazz club outside of London. He was deeply embedded in the jazz scene, but he felt like Liverpool lacked a truly authentic, dedicated space for the music he loved. Sittner didn't just want to open a standard run-of-the-mill bar. He wanted to replicate a very specific bohemian atmosphere that he had experienced firsthand across the English Channel.
And that massive inspiration? It came from a place called Le Caveau de la Huchette. This was a legendary underground jazz cellar located on the left bank of Paris. Sittner took trips to this specific Parisian venue, and it just completely captivated him. It gave him the exact blueprint he needed: the raw energy, the subterranean setting, the acoustics of playing acoustic jazz in a stone basement. He wanted to recreate that authentic underground vibe back home in the UK. He even named his new club The Cavern as a direct English translation and homage to Le Caveau. Let's move on to Chapter 2, Inside the Vaults. Okay, so what did this physical space actually feel like before all the global fame? Finding a spot in Liverpool that matched a Parisian underground cavern was no small feat, but Sittner hit the nail on the head right in the heart of the city. Located at 10 Matthew Street, Liverpool, the space was actually a former Victorian-era wine cellar carved right out of a warehouse basement. During the Second World War, it even served as a damp, echoing air raid shelter. But its most defining architectural feature was, without a doubt, its distinctive brick-vaulted arches. These low, tunnel-like ceilings weren't just for show. They were incredibly effective at amplifying sound, creating this immersive, booming acoustic environment that Sittner knew would be absolutely perfect for the brass and rhythm of traditional jazz.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is that this space was incredibly tight and humid. You weren't just attending a gig, you were surviving it. It was a full-on sensory experience, perfectly captured by Paul McCartney's later description when he called it a claustrophobic hell. Now, McCartney definitely meant that affectionately, but man, it paints a vivid picture. Imagine being packed into an unventilated subterranean brick tunnel, completely cut off from the outside world. The sweat would literally drip from the ceiling. It was high pressure, intense, and utterly captivating.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, Opening Night, January 16, 1957.
All the planning, the Parisian inspiration, that gritty warehouse cellar, it all culminated on this freezing January night. I want you to really picture the scene. It's a bitter winter evening in Liverpool, yet there are hundreds of passionate music fans queuing outside. The original entrance in 1957 was exactly where the Sillerback statue fire exit stands today on Matthew Street. Imagine that long line of people bundled up in heavy coats, just buzzing with anticipation, waiting to descend those incredibly narrow steps, going deep underground into Liverpool's newest cultural hotspot. They were stepping into the total unknown.
In the turnout, it was absolutely staggering. 600 people. Let's just highlight the shocking figure for a second. because the cellar legally had a capacity of just 200 to 300 people. But on that opening night, 600 jazz fans packed themselves shoulder to shoulder into that tiny subterranean space. Every single square inch was filled. It was loud, it was humid, and from the very first chords struck that night, the cellar was vibrantly alive.
Those 600 people squashed into that cellar were treated to an absolute purists lineup. The headliners were the Merseybeat Jazz Band, supported by the Wall City Jazzmen, the Ralph Watmow Jazz Band, and the Coney Island Skiffle Group. This gig firmly established the club's unapologetic traditional jazz and folk skiffle roots. Skiffle, which was this kind of folk-influenced acoustic blues often played with makeshift instruments like washboards, was a massive craze at the time. But again, notice what is completely absent from this list. No rock and roll. None. This was a purist's paradise.
Chapter 4. The Rock and Roll Pivot.
So, despite those packed electric opening nights, the jazz-only business model actually proved pretty difficult to sustain financially. The evolution happened surprisingly fast. We start in January 1957 with the opening as a strict jazz club. But by October 1959, facing money troubles, Alan Seitner sells the lease to his accountant, a guy named Ray McFall, for £2,750. Now, McFall initially tried to keep the jazz dream alive. He even hosted Liverpool's first jazz festival at the venue in January 1960. But, well, the writing was on the wall. The popularity of traditional jazz was beginning to wane, and younger crowds were hungrily looking for something with a different kind of beat.
And this is where history pivots. Ray McFall made a strategic, totally business-savvy decision to introduce beat music and rock and roll. But he did something else that was frankly brilliant. He introduced daytime lunchtime sessions. This allowed local office workers and teenagers to come down on their lunch breaks for live music. Since they weren't serving alcohol during the day, it kept costs low and made the environment super accessible. This one operational change was a real game changer. It set the stage for a massive musical explosion. It became the testing ground for local bands like Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and eventually, a little local group called the Beatles, who would go on to play those lunchtime and evening sessions an astonishing 292 times.
So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. How did a damp, echoing cellar, with brick-vaulted acoustics specifically designed by a 21-year-old visionary for traditional acoustic jazz, inadvertently become the perfect amplifier for the raw electric energy of the Merseybeat revolution? It's just a beautiful twist of fate, isn't it? The very specific claustrophobic infrastructure built in 1957 to keep rock out actually acted as the crucible that forged the sound of the 1960s British rock invasion. It just goes to show, you can build the stage, but you can never truly control the music that will eventually take over it. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep your curiosity alive until next time.